Nice to see you all. Stephen, can you ring that bell?
Okay.
That's it.
Is that effective?
Like it. Good. Thank
That
you.
was for your attention.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this session. My name's Cam. I'm a researcher at the Development Policy Centre here at ANU. As the first session of the day, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Thank you so much for joining us here today for this very special session, something a little bit out of the ordinary for today. I won't have much of a role in this. My job is, first of all, to really thank the group of people that you see in front of you, because this is the first time we've tried this at the Australasian Aid Conference. So these are our guinea pigs. So I just wanted to say a big thanks to all of them for agreeing to be our guinea pigs and be the first group to try this out. And if it goes well and people like it, we might do it again, and we could change the topic from year to year, and we'd be open to suggestions on new topics. So let's see how it goes. My other job here today is to welcome the excellent Stephen Dziedzic from the ABC. Many of you probably know Stephen's work on the ABC, but you probably also know of his amazing capacity to live tweet Senate estimates and big complex policy speeches at rapid speed. These summaries are invaluable, and I think they should be in our national archives. They're fantastic. Stephen is the ABC's Foreign Affairs reporter for the Asia-Pacific, based at the Parliament House Bureau. His work focuses on Australia's relationships with countries across the region. He's also written for Australian Foreign Affairs, the Lowy Institute's Interpreter, and ASPI's The Strategist. Stephen spent 5 years covering federal politics before moving to his current role. He has also worked for DFAT at the Australian High Commission in New Delhi. And before starting at the ABC, Stephen completed a Bachelor of Arts at Sydney University with honours in English. So I'm going to hand it over to Stephen. Thank you all, and good luck, and may the best team win. Thank you. Good luck.
Thanks, Cam. Is this on? Can everyone hear this? Okay, good. I'd struggled with this yesterday. So this is a test run, as Cam said, and I hope everyone is going to be gentle with our panellists. Look, basically we're just trying to have a really interesting conversation about foreign aid and geopolitics. Now, to some extent, this is going to be conducted in character, right? And so the way that we're going to run this is I'm going to give everyone 8 minutes to talk. I'm going to ding them at 7 and then ding them more insistently at 8 minutes, and then get really passive-aggressive at 9 minutes and just start slamming the bell. So we're going to hear 3 speakers on each side, 3 speakers on affirmative, then 3 on negative, all laying out their case. There'll be a little bit of back and forth, I imagine, in that, but they're essentially going to be standalone statements. After that, we're going to go to a vote from the audience, and we're going to do it by acclamation. So basically, holler as loudly as you like for your opposing or your, for the affirmative or the negative. And then we're going to break out of character. We're going to do a brief sort of debrief, just sort of breaking down what just happened, some initial thoughts, and then I'm really keen to throw to you guys as quickly as possible for questions for all of our excellent speakers. I would urge everyone to take this in a good spirit and bear in mind that there is an element of devil's advocacy perhaps happening on both sides, and to take that debate in that spirit. All right, I'm just going to briefly introduce our panelists before we begin. First of all, we'll go through the teams on our, first on my right for the affirmative. Are we going to get rowdy for this, or should I try and keep it more genteel? Whoa. I feel like I need to do like the WWS, like, on my right, we have the affirmative, the monsters of geopolitical maneuver. No. I'm gonna resist the urge, actually. All right, good. Okay. I should have written a script. Cynics all deeply steeped in the military. No, I'm not gonna do it. On my right, we have the affirmative. Please welcome them up. We've got, first of all, Dr. Ben Day. Ben is a lecturer in the Department of International Relations. He's convened also the department's postgraduate course in foreign policy analysis. And then we've also got, on the affirmative side, we've got Bridie Rice. Bridie is known to many of you, of course. She's an international development expert and CEO of the Development Intelligence Lab, which I'm reliably informed is the funkiest gig in town. Everyone says it. And then finally, of course, on the affirmative, we've also got Dr. Henry Ivaracha. Henry is a PNG and Pacific Fellow and also Interim Deputy Director at the Pacific Security College. And he is looking very closely at political instability in Melanesia, although his current role focuses largely on supporting the implementation of the Boe Declaration on Regional Security. So that is our team for the affirmative. Geopolitics, good for 8. Give them a hand, ladies and gentlemen. Negative. Purists all. We've got Alice Ridge, first on the left, Senior Research Policy and Advocacy Advisor at the International Women's Development Agency, where she leads advocacy on feminist foreign policy. Alice is one of the 2022 young women to watch in international affairs, which is a cracking list of terrifyingly smart people. Second, we've got then Dr. Terence Wood. Many of you know Terence, of course, a research fellow at the Department of Policy Centre. His work focuses on electoral politics in the Western Pacific. I love this. This is his bio, but I say it's a debating point. Quote, Terence is a China panic, in capitals, skeptic. So that gives you a good sense of where he is coming from. And then finally, of course, we have Ofa. Ofa is an oceanic feminist researcher and storyteller, a woman and children's rights advocate. I wasn't here for her session yesterday, but at least 7 people have separately come up to me and said, you need to go back and watch her session yesterday. So I intend to do that when I get a chance. And she's contributed to research on women's political participation, as well as the impact of COVID on women's economic empowerment in Tonga. So ladies and gentlemen, that is the No team for today's debate. It is not good. Okay, I'm going to start. First of all with, now who was first? Dr. Day, is that right? Yep. The floor is yours, sir.
Wonderful. I'll let you know when you can start the timer. I would like to begin by announcing that today the affirmative team has decided to break with debating convention, and we're going to actually speak today in order of how outdated our real-world experience is. So I'm first. I too, like you, was once an aid worker. But I've bravely left that world in search for rigour, purpose and answers. I confess that I'm yet to find any of those things, but I did get a PhD. And so we then move on to Bridie, our second speaker, who was also once an aid worker, but now she cooks up development ideas, as you've heard, at the Development Intelligence Lab, which I hear is an entrepreneurial incubator startup accelerator. In short, you're going to have to wait until our third speaker, Dr. Henry Ivaracha, before you get some frank, first-hand, real-world inspired, region-specific commentary on why geopolitical competition is good for aid. When our team met for this debate, they realised I didn't have any relevant ideas. So I asked Bridie to incubate me one. She suggested that because I'm an academic, I might like to do definitions and other historical stuff. The Oxford English Dictionary defines geopolitics as the political relations between countries and groups of countries in the world as influenced by their geography. Notice here how there's no mention of national interest, nor a reference to realpolitik. In fact, the definition conveys no negative connotations at all. This helps confirm that we are the ones who have transformed the descriptive term geopolitics into a weasel word that conjures notions of shrewd self-interest and nefarious Kissingerian string-pulling in the shadows. In summary, my core contention this morning is that the development crowd has bought into the mistaken notion that geopolitics is a dirty word. I can help with that. Repeat after me. Geopolitics is not a dirty word. Excellent. I've made progress already. I'll probably sit down. But I've got 3 key takeaways for you. 1, geopolitics describes political relations. It doesn't direct them. As I've described, the way we mistakenly understood the term geopolitics implies we have no agency. It suggests we merely float without a paddle down the geopolitical stream. Number two, geopolitical competition is like gravity. Like gravity, geopolitical competition just is, like death, taxes, and Stephen Howe's post-budget analysis. And because of that, it follows that, number three, we ignore geopolitics at your peril. And so for the rest of my allotted time this morning, I'm going to flick back in time and then quickly step us through to the present, not only as a way to set the platform for my fellow speakers, but to show you that geopolitical competition is good for aid. So let's take a time travel back to 1947. George Catlett Marshall is peering out of his aeroplane window, scanning the clouds above the Atlantic. Over the previous month, Marshall had been in Moscow. But most historians point to this flight as the moment when Marshall realised the United States and the Soviet Union could no longer cooperate. Rather than attempting to defy gravity, Marshall understood that you ignore geopolitics at your peril. And how did Marshall respond to geopolitical competition? With aid. With a tremendous amount of good aid that we now remember as the Marshall Plan. We call for Marshall Plans, new Marshall Plans all the time, but we do so without truly understanding how this was an enterprise concocted in response to geopolitical competition. Our contemporary sensibilities mean we tend to be sensible when people tell us that we can be both altruistic and strategic. But don't take my word for it. George Berman, in his History of the Marshall Plan, concluded that the Marshall Plan was an act of beneficence and an unabashedly strategic enterprise framed in a shifting and perilous geopolitical context. In case you missed that, that was one sentence with the phrases unprecedented beneficence, unabashedly strategic, and geopolitical context. It's no exaggeration to say that without the Marshall Plan, we wouldn't be here. In her wonderful new book, Global Development: A Cold War History, Sarah Lorenzini explains how historians almost unanimously consider the Marshall Plan a watershed and hold it responsible for both the onset of the Cold War and European integration. More than that, building on the apparatus established by the Marshall Plan, Lorenzini documents how the Cold War was fundamental in shaping the aspirations and ideologies of development and modelling the institutional structures that still rule foreign aid today. Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that propping up dictators is a good way to spend aid, but I am happy to stand with Lorenzini, who argues that this is too simplistic a way to understand how aid functioned in the Cold War. A much better reading of history, she says, is as a contest of universal ideas. Aid, according to Lorenzini, was used by East and West to transmit ideas and values to recipients. In other words, aid is an expression of geopolitics, of the political relations between countries and their fundamentally different views on how to organise economic, political and social life. Development, argues Lorenzini, was absorbed into East-West competition, becoming a battle to conquer hearts and minds. It was a cultural project that required donors and recipients to agree on notions of modernity and progress. Don't you agree that this sounds eerily applicable to our present moment? Of course it does, because you ignore geopolitics at your peril. But don't take my word for it. In his recent book, Belt and Road, A Chinese World Order, Bruno Maches argues forcefully that the Belt and Road is the Chinese plan to build a new world order replacing the US-led international system. Now, he is somewhat of an outlier in his views here on the coherence of the BRI, but his underlying assumptions are, I think, sound. Geopolitical competition is like gravity. It's always there, even if we don't acknowledge it. Part of the reason, I think, why some development folk are feeling a little imperiled at this time of geopolitical flux is, I think, because we got used to ignoring geopolitics. The notion that we even need to debate whether geopolitical competition is good for aid is a product of a very peculiar historical moment. Since the end of the Cold War, during that magical snatch of time known as the unipolar moment, we've behaved as though we could defy gravity. But if you happen to be participating in the so-called end of history from outside the West, you would have been singing from a very different song sheet. In fact, speaking of defying gravity, one might even imagine emerging donors in the 2000s singing along with Elphaba from the musical Wicked. Something has changed within me. Something is not the same. I'm through with playing by the rules of someone else's game. The reality is we all want to play by our own rules. But there really is only one rule. You ignore geopolitics at your peril. Now, this might sound fatalistic, but it's not. As I began by saying, geopolitics describes political relations. It doesn't direct them. George Catlett Marshall understood that geopolitics was not a dirty word. Rather, he rejected the allure of defying gravity and got on with the job of providing good aid. We would do well to follow his example.
Thank you. Well, aside from the Frozen reference, which literally sent horrified shivers down my spine because I have a 5-year-old, that was excellent. All right, Dr. Terence Wood, the first speaker for the negative. Ladies and gentlemen, please give him a hand.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And much like the other side, we had a bit of a team huddle yesterday and discussed who was going to do what. And we realized that the only person on our team as detached from reality as Ben was me. And so we have decided that I'm going to speak first. And in fitting with my role as someone a little bit detached from reality, I am, like Ben, going to start off on definitional matters before moving on to a bit of history for you. So once again, very similarly structured to Ben's talk. After I've done with that, and once the other side has had their chance to speak, Offa is going to speak to us about the impact of geopolitics on the all-important power dynamics of aid. And then our third speaker, Alice, is going to speak about the impact of geopolitics on just who benefits from aid and who is excluded from those benefits. So that's the way we're going to structure our argument as a team today. First up, me. Well, let's get into definitional matters. Unlike Ben, I'm not that interested in dictionaries. I'm more interested in the real world and what actually happens. And in that sort of manner, when I looked at the topic for today's debate, I thought this is remarkably imprecise. Geopolitical competition is good for aid. I mean, aid is a lumbering, non-sentient financial flow. Clearly, we don't care about aid for aid's sake. What we're really worried about is the impact of aid on people's lives. And so aid can have many different types of outcomes, many different impacts on people's lives, some of which are undesirable. Aid can ensconce dictators in power. Aid can fund corruption. Aid can make the already wealthy even wealthier. But I doubt that there are many people in this room who would consider those outcomes desirable outcomes from aid giving. And so to better reflect the spirit that we think underpins this debate, and also which underpins this conference, when we talk about aid, we are going to focus on the argument that geopolitical competition will not be good for aid's ability to help people in need. That seems to be what aid really ought to be about, and that's what we're interested in. And why do I personally believe that geopolitical competition will not be good for people, for aid's ability to help people in need? Well, one of the reasons, and Ben will be familiar with this somewhat, is to do with what happened to aid in the Cold War. And that was a period, obviously, of intense geopolitical competition between the 1940s and the early 1990s. And this was a time when aid was all too often was not used to help people in what was then called the Third World, but was rather frequently focused on procuring the allegiance of politicians in Third World countries to make sure that they didn't join the other side. And Ben quoted some historians, but I would prefer myself to go to the horse's mouth. President John F. Kennedy of the United States, and this is what he had to say about aid in the Cold War. He said, "Foreign aid is a method by which the United States maintains a position of influence and control around the world and sustains a good many countries which would definitely otherwise pass into the communist bloc." So that was one of the primary motives for aid giving during the Cold War. And while Ben had some nice things to say about the Marshall Plan, can anyone remind me what part of the world did the Marshall Plan, where was that aid given to? Europe, I believe. Strategically situated between the Soviet Union and the Allied powers of Western Europe. So, sui generis, I would argue. On the other hand, most of the aid today goes to developing countries who are in a much different situation than Europe was in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And a much better example, if you're trying to get a sense of what the impact of geopolitics might be on aid's ability to help those in need at the present moment, is to have a look at what happened to the countries of the Third World during the Cold War. And so during that period of time in the Third World, aid was too often given with few strings attached and was too often given to ruthless dictators. People like Mobutu Sese Seko in the country that was then called Zaire. And in Zaire's case, as part of a policy of rewarding Mobutu for being anti-communist, the United States prevailed upon the World Bank and IMF to loan Mobutu money, even though the multilateral organizations warned the United States that Mobutu and his allies would simply steal the money and that Zaire would become even more indebted as a result. What happened? Well, the multilaterals lent the money, but they were also right in their advice. Mobutu and his cronies stole the money. Zaire was left heavily indebted, and its GDP per capita fell by 2/3 between its emergence as an independent state and the end of the Cold War. So the Marshall Plan sounds nice, but for the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Cold War was rather disastrous, and the impact of aid during the Cold War, at least in terms of helping people in need, was negligible. And Zaire, or what's now called the Democratic Republic of Congo, was not an isolated case. Throughout sub-Saharan Africa and the world's least developed countries more generally, GDP per capita only really started to increase after the Cold War came to an end. And to be clear, not all the disastrous impacts of the Cold War on developing countries were a result of aid. However, there are a number of rigorous econometric studies which show, for example, that aid failed to foster democratization during the Cold War. However, once the Cold War came to an end, aid started to become a more effective tool in promoting democratization. Similarly, there are studies that suggest that aid failed to promote economic growth during the Cold War. However, once the Cold War came to an end, aid started to be a more effective tool for promoting economic growth. Now, it's true there were some successes associated with aid during the Cold War. The Green Revolution would be a useful example. Yet the average effect of aid on the lives of people in need was worse during the Cold War than it was afterwards. Aid was less effective in helping people during that major historical epoch where geopolitics directed much of the way that aid was spent. Now, I'm sure that our esteemed opponents on the other side of the debate are just itching to say, well, that was then, this is now. We've learned our lessons. The new Cold War with China won't be like the last Cold War. Haven't heard what you have to say yet, but I'm trying to preempt it. Let's all hope that they're right, and let's all hope that that's true, but I am something of a skeptic. I don't think we have learned our lessons, and I don't think geopolitics will be any more healthy for aid's ability to help those in need this time round. And why do I say this? Well, because we can already see examples of aid being given very poorly owing to the influence of geopolitics. One example, and there are others, but I just want to keep things somewhat parsimonious so I stay within the time limit, is the recent race... Hey, hang on a second, that was 7 seconds too early. Between Australia and China to arm the Solomon Islands Police Force, to provide weaponry to the Solomon Islands Police Force. Why are Australia and China currently jostling and using aid to arm a police force with a very checkered history? Well, it's because they're listening to the requests of Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare. I guess that sort of sounds okay, doesn't it? They're listening to a Prime Minister. At least it sounds okay until you understand Sogavare's very fraught relationship with the people in his country right now. Sogavare first became the Prime Minister of Solomon Islands in a coup in the late 1990s, a coup that was staged by the police force, I should add. He has been re-elected 4 times since then, and when he became Prime Minister the 4th time, in the wake of the 2019 elections, people marched around the streets of Honiara protesting, shouting, "We need change, we need change." Sogavare wants an armed police force because he has a fraught relationship with the populace of Honiara and also of the neighbouring island of Malaita. Given this fraught relationship, does it really seem sensible that aid is being used as part of a literal arms race to try and provide weapons to the Solomon Islands police force right now? Does that really sound like the sort of aid that is likely to help the people of Solomon Islands at present? I don't think so. And that's just one of the reasons why I don't think foreign aid is effective in helping people in need when it is contaminated by geopolitics. Geopolitics is not good for aid's ability to help, and geopolitics is not good for foreign aid. That's all I have to say today. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Terence. I accidentally actually gave you an extra 40 seconds, so you must have been fairly captivating.
You can give
Yeah.
a
I'll give it. I'll hand over.
there.
Thank you also for those. Yeah. Thank you also for those little bursts of sass. That was. Yeah. That's what we like. Henry. Oh no, Bridie. Sorry, when I was saying Bridie's next. Sorry, Bridie. Bridie Rice, everyone. Give her a hand.
You know that times are desperate when Terence is being sassy. I've never seen it before. I'd actually quite like to see it again.
Normally, for those who don't know, I stick to spreadsheets.
But Terence has just laid out for you a frighteningly false logic. What he is saying is that bad aid, corruption, ineffectiveness, the world's evil, is because of geopolitics. But as a former anti-corruption advisor, having watched the financial flows in and out of not just Solomon Islands, but many other countries in the region, I can tell you that corruption, issues of democracy, transparency, accountability, are challenges that a development program and our own governments have faced for the last 80 years. Irrespective, perhaps turbocharged by geopolitics, but these are pre-existing issues, and as Ben laid out for us in his 100-year history lesson, thank you Ben, loved your definitions, geopolitics is just like gravity, it exists. So now, for the real world, Terence. My colleague Ben has laid out for you that ignoring geopolitics, ignoring this gravity, this thing that it just exists, is ignoring history at our peril. And I am now going to put to you that it is not just ignoring history at our peril, it is also irresponsible as a development community, and it's downright arrogant. So I've got 2 propositions for you. The first one, thanks Ben, they're not just good at definitions, they're really good at images for audiences and euphemisms, so thanks Ben for this. My proposition to you is, geopolitics is a furnace. We can feel it here, we can feel it when we travel. Those of you who live in the region breathe it every day. And its heat reveals who we are and what is important to us. And I would put to you that in fact, this geopolitical heat we have lived over the last few years in our region, without it, we would not be half the development partner we are today, nor the development partner that we can become. Because we had little reason to change people. The gravitational pull of the status quo to do what we've been doing as an aid community, as a development community for the last little while, was too strong. Even just 5 years ago, beyond these safe walls, but perhaps in the halls of Parliament or elsewhere, it wasn't okay to talk about development, it wasn't okay to talk about poverty. I was making a career trying to convince politicians that development mattered by not using the term development. And today in this room, we heard from the Minister yesterday that development is the heart of our foreign policy. We have ministers that are travelling to the developing nations around us more than they have ever travelled before. 5 years ago, we were inevitably accepting budget cuts. Now, we're trading blows about what's gone up and down, sure, but we are hopeful of a stable budget and an increasing one with increased finance. People in this room 5 years ago were banging on about the importance of labour mobility, visa integration, new forms of finance. These are all things, we're not doing them perfectly now, but we are doing them. These are seeds of change. We couldn't talk about climate change much 5 years ago. We've now heard it is at the centre point of our new development policy here in Australia. And civil society, the thing that is so dear to so many people's hearts, was not a feature of discussions around development 5 years ago. And again, now, with our recognition of the importance of civil society to development, to great nations, we are seeing a comeback in focus as well. These are all significant changes. And let me say it because nobody has said it yet. China, and I'm talking about the People's Republic of China, the government of China, is the shock that we needed to reckon with in order for us to change. Our geopolitical furnace revealed that actually we care too. And why? The answer we would like to give is that our government woke up and read all our wonderful papers and took action as a result. Shocking alert. No, it was China. And the geopolitics is a driver for fantastic changes in aid and development, if we allow it and if we harness it. So my second proposition to you is that geopolitics will shape development. Trade shapes economies. Respect shapes relationships. Choices shape the autonomy of nations. And Terence, I don't want to quote a US president, but I will quote a couple of Pacific friends on this. When one friend described to me the arrival of Xi Jinping as he flew into the nation of Papua New Guinea for the APEC conference, Xi, a great friend of the Australian government for a very long time, a great pro-democracy supporter, described the shock she felt as instead of arriving and ducking straight into a hotel, she and his people spread out through her nation. They spent the night in villages in Papua New Guinea. They spent days eating Papua New Guinean food. And when Xi Jinping stood up and gave his speech in her country, she said, in spite of myself, I felt heard. I heard somebody who understood what I had gone through. And at the same time, Bridie, your ministers were flying in and out of my country. They couldn't even stay overnight. Same with the US. This is the story of somebody that felt respected by a nation that is leading its development program with a principle around shared development and partnership that looks a little bit different to the way that we talk about partnership ourselves. So at the lab we thought, hey, we've got this new development strategy coming. What happens if we speak to 50 Pacific Islanders and get their perspective on what is important to Australian development? And of course, in addition to localisation, climate change, and various other priorities they had, they all regarded geopolitics as being foundational to shaping the future of their nation and foundational to shaping a more equitable relationship with our country. So I put to you that there is an opportunity in geopolitics and aid for Australia to be a more honest partner. Not to pretend, but to deliver fantastic development results and be honest about the geopolitical relationships that we have in doing so. So, ignoring geopolitics isn't just bad for development, but it's refusing to hear our partners. And if we let it, then geopolitics can be the gift. It could even be the driving force behind many of our aspirations of decolonising aid, localising it as well. But it is up to us to harness the potential, even if we don't agree with the motivations. So, In concluding, is geopolitics good for aid? Absolutely. It is the driver of the best reform we have seen in the Australian Development Cooperation Program in the last 5 years. Ignore it at your peril.
I'm just gonna wash it off.
Thanks, Bridie. Really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, our second speaker for the negative offer. The floor is yours.
Okay, everybody repeat after me. Geopolitics is not a dirty word. But it has done dirty things. I start off on the premises of the positioning of the Pacific. When we talk about geopolitics, we have been labelled as the third world. We have been labelled as small developing island states. We have been termed by a European navigator explorer when they first hit our shores as many tiny Pacific islands spread far, far apart and removed far, far away from the rest of the world. So that Pacific positioning on the global map itself leads to often, and most often leads to discussions where there is a hierarchy when we talk about geopolitics. And it's about, when we talk about geopolitics, we're talking about domination, we're talking about power, and we're talking about distribution. And whose hands is the power in? Now, right off, in terms of those labeling terms that I gave you of the Pacific Islands, we are way at the bottom of the hierarchy in the eyes of geopolitics. And it's sad, because when we talk about geopolitics, we do have to talk about power. We do have to talk about the hierarchy of where we are in the world, and we have to talk about hierarchy in terms of the power dynamics. I wanted to talk about some examples from the Pacific because unlike these academics and professionals here who are sitting up on the panel, I'm a realist. And I speak from the grassroots, and I talk to you about examples of how geopolitics is not good for aid when hierarchy is involved and when power play is involved, right? So let's talk about when Tonga was negotiating to be a member of the World Trade Organization. We had arguably the worst terms offered to us. And the countries behind that push, the United States of America, New Zealand, and China, they pushed us so far that we had to open up 26 service sectors. No other Pacific country or other country in the world had to open up the number of service sectors that we had to open up. That meant that we had to open up our health sector, our education sector, all the sectors that we should have had sovereignty over. But we didn't, because we were being bullied. We were being bullied by the superpowers in the room who sat at the table with our government. But because there was a power dynamic at play, who has the resources, who has the money, we will then make the decisions. What about when Australia sent one of their prime ministers into the Cook Islands in 2012 to declare this brilliant and beautiful declaration of gender equality to all the Pacific Island Forum leaders? That came with 3 focus areas already pre-designed by Australia. Were the women's organizations on the grassroots level consulted? Were women's activists and movement shakers across the Pacific consulted? No. We were just given 3 areas to work on in terms of achieving gender equality, because that's where the money was. Ending violence against women, women in political participation, women's economic empowerment. For other women's rights movements across the Pacific who were working for self-determination, and political freedom and liberation, such as West Papua and the territories of the United States of America, they had no voice in the Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration. And I find it funny when we put Pacific in the front of these declarations and these agreements, because really, when we think about who holds the power behind it, it's the countries with the money. It's Australia and New Zealand. We will dictate where it goes, and we will dictate what you should spend and invest your time in for the next 10 years. What about the Pacific Mobility Scheme? My parents left Tonga as unskilled migrants. When the New Zealand government opened up for people to come and work who had no skills but could work in the factories and build up New Zealand's economy. It was a political agreement between New Zealand and Tonga. My parents left, they worked the factories, and then the dawn raids hit. After we had gotten New Zealand to a state where they were quite happy with their economy, they wanted to kick us all out. So they sent dogs and police officers to raid our homes in the early 70s and 80s to return us back to Tonga, to Samoa, to wherever in the Pacific we are. Fast forward now to the 2000s, we have the Pacific Labour Mobility Scheme with the fruit seasonal pickers. Great, we're bringing money back into our economies. But what about the situations they're living in Australia and New Zealand? Are we taking care of them? Are they being taken care of? Do they have access to the same level of rights? Access to health, access to education, access to all the things that you have access to? The power isn't balanced. It's not equal. And what about things like aid is good for the Pacific, I heard? Yeah, it is. It is good. But then when China sends in chairs and tables for our schools and fully resources them, and our students can't even fit in those chairs, and those desks break within 1 or 2 years, or when Europe sends in solar panels for the outer line islands, and now those solar panels don't even work, and they're not even maintained and sustained, what aid are we talking about that is good for the Pacific? So I leave you with that. And you talk about the story, I love your story in Papua New Guinea, of this leader who spent the night and ate the food. You're actually on our side. That's what we're saying. We're saying to break down the hierarchy of geopolitical aid. We're saying to break down and stand shoulder to shoulder, what Australia's current foreign minister said. You're saying that leader had listened. That's what we're saying. We're saying geopolitics is not an ugly word, but it has done ugly things, and now we need to reverse that. Malo.
Thank you, Offa. All right, we've got the final speaker now. Ladies and gentlemen, a hand for Henry as he finishes off the case for the affirmative.
Friends, colleagues, Kainga, and One Talks. I'll pick up from my two One Talks, Ben and Brady, and share my thoughts from a Pacific perspective. Offa has done that, but being a Pacific Islander on where I think geopolitical competition, which is, as they said, ever present, is good for aid. And I'd like to add that geopolitical competition is also good for building and strengthening relations. It's good for the Pacific, I must say, and at the moment, and about time, right? I wholeheartedly agree that this is a really big and complex topic. So I will be, if I offend anyone, please excuse me. I will be talking about some aspects of geopolitics that is being waged in the Pacific between the major and middle powers. I'll give some examples of aid provided under this environment and give reasons why I believe this is really great for the Pacific. Now, according to some Australian academics, 2018 was the year Australia's posture towards China shifted from one of competition to, from cooperation to competition. This shift in posture was partly forced by China's increasing presence in the Pacific Islands and its strategic edge between 2011 and 2021. Although geopolitics has been about in the region prior to that, let's say this is the point that Pacific Islanders also experienced intensified interest in terms of security and development aid, building up to, say, 2021, when geopolitical competition, I think, really intensified. It's largely the result of China's efforts to increase its influence in the Pacific Islands. ANU scholar, his name is Denghua Zhang, in his recent blog titled China's Influence as a Pacific Donor, lists the 8 different aid assistance provided by China since 2028, drawing on the Lowy Institute's 2022 Pacific Aid Map. Between 2008 and 2020, China provided a total of nearly US 3.148 billion in aid to the Pacific. Denghua also notes, however, that Chinese aid has fluctuated somewhat from a total of US 204 million in 2008, increasing to US 334 million in 2016, and dropping to US 188 million in 2020. A slowing Chinese economy because of the pandemic, COVID-19, and difficult relations with the West, according to Denghua, may see further decline. I don't think this trend will stop competition for influence in the Pacific, particularly from Australia and the United States, who, by the way, see the Pacific as their backyard. I think China's attempt this year to sign a region-wide security and economic agreement with several Pacific Island states and the controversy created by the bilateral security agreement with Solomon Islands has not only intensified geopolitical competition between the major and middle powers, but I think we will see aid in all manners and forms come to this region. Inside Solomon Islands, China is building a national sports stadium worth US $53 million. Once completed, my One Talks in Solomon Islands will host the South Pacific Games, where athletes, men and women from the Pacific, will converge in Honiara to compete in different track and field events. Let's call it the Pacific Island One Talks networking through sports and getting to know each other at the individual level. After that, my Solomon Islands One Talks will hold its general election, which its governments had deferred for this purpose, for this big Pacific family get-together. China is also building a dormitory complex for students at the Solomon Islands National University. This project is worth US $21.4 million. It will enable Solomon Island students learning at this higher learning education institution. With their learning, build their capacity and capability, and they will contribute to their socio-economic development in the future. These are the young men and women who will become the future leaders of their country. China is also building a comprehensive medical center at the National Referral Hospital and 161 mobile towers. Collectively, these investments are worth US $66 million. Health infrastructure in the Pacific states need improvement, and such investments will allow my Solomon Islands One Talks with health services, better health services, care and treatment. I hope that aid in the form of medical aid and supplies will follow on after this infrastructure is built. Now, many Pacific Islanders live in rural areas. I know from my country, Papua New Guinea, that approximately 80% or more people live their lives in rural areas. So investments in mobile towers across Solomon Islands allows families to connect, to be informed about events happening around them, including accessing other internet services, such as mobile banking. So Telstra's decision to purchase Dziedzic, which was largely subsidized by the Australian government, was driven by fears of a potential buyout by Chinese companies and which could potentially be used for espionage activities. Nonetheless, it's a decision that enables Dziedzic to continue to provide internet and communication access for many Pacific Islanders. Dziedzic, as you all know, had an enormous transformational impact in the Pacific. So let's hope that the bandwidth is improved and the prices are made more affordable. More recently, China also assisted my Kainga in Tonga with relief supplies in the wake of the volcanic eruption and related tsunami disaster in January 2022. Now this fellow he's really messed up my train of thought. Anyway, let me just go to the final point. I have a lot to say, but I'll go to the final point. Now, Pacific's traditional partners are stepping up their assistance to assistance, yeah? So Australia, through its Pacific Step Up. The US, through the Pacific Partnership. The UK, with its Pacific Uplift. And the New Zealanders, I think it was called Pacific Reset, but I think they've changed their name more recently. They are all competing and responding to China and its Belt and Road Initiative for influence and footprint in the Pacific. Others have been drawn into the same game as well, which includes the European Union's Strategy for Cooperation in the Pacific, which is released in 2021. And even Indonesia has come in with its Pacific elevation. So the Pacific is looking like getting a major aid facelift and an aid makeover. So, thank you, geopolitics.
All right. Alice, our final speaker for today. Ladies and gentlemen, give her a hand, and then after that, we'll go to the acclamation.
How's that? Still not on? What about now? Great. All right, so I'm not sure if Belconnen High School had a debating team in the early 2000s, some Canberrans here, but if it did, I was not part of it. So I asked my 13-year-old cousin for some tips. She's on her school debating team. She suggested, as the third speaker for the negative, it was really my job to sum up my team's arguments and rebut the other team. So I'm going to do that. I'm probably going to introduce some new material as well, because I don't really follow the rules. So Terence started out by laying out what we mean by good for aid, that it's not just a matter of aid volume. Ultimately, what we care about is whether aid is doing good in the world. Is it achieving justice? And he positioned this in the context of the Cold War and the way that aid has been used as a geopolitical tool throughout history. We then heard from Ofer about how this plays out on the ground, what that push and pull looks like from the Pacific. And Ofer also positioned this debate in terms of power, that ultimately geopolitics is another way of saying how can we get more power and contain the power of others. So our opponents have tried to define geopolitics in a neutral way. And in response, I would quote our Foreign Minister Penny Wong, who says, "We take the world as it is and seek to change it for the better." So we have to take geopolitics as it is. It is about national interest. That's how it plays out in the world today. But what I think we can do is we don't have to choose that reality of national interest as the only way to think about geopolitics. We can choose something better. And to bring it back to Wicked, I would point out the song is defying gravity, not denying gravity. So we're not denying that gravity exists, but we are getting in a hot air balloon and choosing to navigate gravity a bit differently. So, thank you. I didn't think my knowledge of musical theatre would come in handy today, but it has. All right, so I want to bring together Terence and Ofer's analysis with an example. So Terence spoke about the competition between Australia and China to provide arms to the Solomon Islands police force. And I think what this really illustrates is that all countries involved are thinking about, it tells us how they're thinking about the nature of security. They're thinking about national security rather than human security. So a feminist approach with a feminist foreign policy lens would tell us that actually human security is the foundational unit of national security. And security at the individual level is gendered. That is, what people require to be secure is different because of the gendered power relations that exist in societies. So to put it simply, for women, trans and gender diverse people, this means freedom from gender-based violence. It makes no sense to say that we have a secure and stable region if people are not safe in their homes. And this matters at the national level as well. The Asian Development Bank identifies gender inequality as the greatest risk factor for state fragility in the Pacific. Gender-based violence at the individual level, low representation of women in formal leadership positions, these issues are predictors of fragility, not only in the Pacific, but all around the world. So what we can see in the case of Solomon Islands is that this narrow conception of what national security means that we're contributing to an arms race that does nothing to make the region more safe or to make Solomon Islanders more secure. I should acknowledge Australia is also funding some really incredible work led by Pacific women like OFA on GBV, but it is pocket change compared to the money we're spending in other sectors. So recently the government has committed that all programs over 3 million have to have a gender equality objective, which is really fantastic. I think it's a really welcome development. And it's important because currently just 4% of Australian aid goes to initiatives with gender equality as the principal objective, and less than 1% goes to women's rights organisations, which are the most effective organisations on gender equality. All right, so I do want to introduce a slightly different argument than what we've been discussing so far. So something that comes up at every aid conference is a debate around whether or not we should be trying to use national security arguments to raise the level of public support for aid in Australia. The argument for doing this is that it's a way to cut through on the importance of aid with those who are unconvinced by the moral case, whether that's because they don't see the value in it or because it's just too far down the list of competing priorities. So it's really tempting to think that the national security case will be persuasive, but the evidence shows this isn't the case. So we've got this slide up. So many of you will be familiar with the Common Cause Handbook for communicating on social issues. This handbook is based on decades of research to identify common human values that are held by people across cultures. These include all different kinds of values like equality, ambition, wealth, intelligence, humility, respect for tradition, friendship. So it's a really diverse set of values. And what you can see here is that these values are clustered. So this map shows the closer values are together, the more likely they are to be held by the same people at the same time. And so they can be kind of clustered into these themes. What it also shows you is that the values that appear further apart are unlikely to be held at the same time. So it's both in terms of the values people hold, but also the values that we evoke when we talk in certain frames. And what you can see is that the value of national security, which, yeah, it's a value. People hold that value. People want to feel secure. They want to feel secure in their nation state. But it's down the bottom here under security, and all these universal values like equality, environmental protection, a world at peace are basically polar opposites. So what we do when we evoke the concept of national security to communicate aid is that we're evoking these other kind of values like reciprocity. We heard the minister say yesterday, Australian aid is never demanding a reciprocity. We never put strings on our aid. But actually what we do when we talk about aid in terms of national security is we trigger those kinds of values and beliefs. Okay, I've gone off my notes, so now I have to figure out where I was up to. Yeah, so what I wanted to point out here is that someone brought up the 2014 federal budget, which was pretty disastrous for the aid community. I'm sure many people still have some trauma from that experience. When we saw Australian aid cut by 20%, I think what we sometimes forget is that Greens voters supported those cuts in the context of other cuts that were happening in the budget at that time. So if it was a choice between aid and Medicare, for Greens voters, who are statistically the most likely to support the aid program, they were fine with the cuts because we triggered this sense of insecurity, this sense of scarcity. There's not enough to go around. We have to protect ourselves. I'm going to wrap up. To conclude, I think you'll agree we've made a strong case here in the negative, which can really be summed up by the question, good for who? Geopolitics is not good for aid, not according to history, not according to the Pacific, not for women and other marginalised groups, and not for convincing the Australian people. Thank you.
All right, the frozen line was very good, but it's still triggering because I mentioned... Oh, it's from Wicked. Oh, I'm just showing my absolute ignorance of all things musical. All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is the moment for the acclamation. Why don't we just do it by screaming and shouting as loudly as we can? Because I can't think of any other better way of doing it. If you believed, ladies and gentlemen, that the affirmative was the most persuasive, please holler out, clap them, give them a holler. Ladies and gentlemen, geopolitics, good for foreign aid. Do you agree? If you disagree, you can still clap, clap politely. You don't have to... Someone like stony-faced in the audience. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you believe that geopolitics is in fact bad for aid, holler right now. That was really close. All right, I'm going to do it one more time. Ladies and gentlemen, for the yes! For the no. All right, I'm going to grant it to the no's on the voices. Can we give all our panelists, though, a big round of applause? Thanks, everyone, for speaking and for raising such interesting ideas and dealing with them so frankly and in such a provocative way. I thought it was great. Look, we'll go to a couple of reflections from all the panelists first before opening it as quickly as I can to the audience for questions. Look, I'll start with you guys first. Perhaps Bridie, perhaps you first. What do you think is when you were making the case, what do you think in retrospect was the least convincing part of your argument? Sorry, that's a horrible question to ask. But what to you was the most, what to you really struck you as something that you really deeply believed? When you talked about it being a shock, that seemed to be quite a sincere point you were making, a shock to the system.
Yeah.
But what was the bit that was perhaps least persuasive to you?
Yeah, so it's super tough to put the Birkenstocks away for today and be up here. But one of the things I am pretty convinced about is that the shockwave that we've felt go through places like Washington and Canberra is a critical moment. And if you think about the sorts of change that comes out of critical moments, you need policymakers and powerful policymakers to be a bit off kilter. So I genuinely, when we were putting the case together, believed that, a mirror being held up to Australia and us being asked, actually, are we worse than those devilish Chinese, officials that we're competing with, is a moment where our policymakers, I saw them flip and they started asking, well, what do the Pacific Islanders actually want? And suddenly there was everything we'd been advocating for the last 5 or 10 years about listening to partners and being led by our partners. It wasn't just a nice to do. I see it becoming a really essential modus operandi for our departments and our managing contractors and our NGOs. The unconvincing piece about that is, are we going to be clumsy with that? And are we going to turn it into a transactional nature? And I think we saw in the early days of the competition, post-2018 in particular, we saw some really clumsy moves and we saw awkward moments on soft power and influence and all the rest of it. But I'm not convinced that that's how it has to be. And I do think that if we can overcome this clumsiness, I love this slide, but I think we need to be really careful to not confuse geopolitics, which is international relations and relationships and who we are as a country in our region, with a national security discussion. That's something different, right? So I think I'm worried about the clumsiness because I think there's a grand opportunity to actually use the geopolitical moment to rebalance the power. And I think that's, at least my colleagues in the Pacific are excited about that moment. Can we do it? Well, we're still working it out, I think.
Yeah. All right, I might just quickly go to Ofer on that and to Terence as well, perhaps. But Ofer, you talked a lot about the way that you felt that Tonga had been treated with contempt by officials from the US, Australia, from multilateral institutions. Is it possible, though, that in this climate when the stakes have been really ratcheted up, Australian officials, or Western officials, could have a very powerful incentive to respond to the needs of the Pacific with more sensitivity, if for no other reason than it's effective, and they realise that they can't simply stick to the old script.
No, yeah, and I return to how I started, my debate. Geopolitics is not an ugly word. It's not bad. It's just that it's done bad things because of the hierarchy involved in terms of the power imbalance and how it's been distributed. And I think when you're talking about the shock, again, that shock is still at that level. I mean, and we come back to Alice's question, who is it good for? So when we're talking about aid and we're talking about the people, there's a huge disconnect, and we need to start bringing that gap, getting rid of that gap. And it's by listening. It's by listening, genuinely listening to the actors on the ground and what needs to happen in terms of if we're talking about aid for development for who, and what type of development is needed, and so yeah, everything that I summed up.
All right, look, I'm really conscious we don't have much time, so I want to throw it right now to the floor. Questions for either the pro or the... Oh, do you want to just say... Yeah, great. Hands up. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, moderator, and thank you very much for the perspective given, both positive and negative. I'm Pusotirak. I'm from Cambodia. I think when you're referencing history, and to me it's very important to understand whether geopolitical is good or bad for aid, referencing martial law, Cambodian reconstructions. You can understand whether at that time geopolitical situation is it the same today. But I think aid, if you want to understand aid, the effect of aid and the relationship between politics and aid, you need to understand post-COVID world order is not like the historical context. That's one point I would like to ask, that you look into the future and starting from now. Precisely, I think that aid remains sound and very good for development only if and when geopolitical consideration is taken aside from aid. Don't tie them together. They're not bad in their own entity, but you put them together, it's create many bad effects. And I agree with the negative side. So what I'm saying is, you look at ASEAN today, between US and China. You look at my country today, that we receive so much Chinese aid, where we cut ourselves short with other options. The EU want to also help Cambodia. The American want to help Cambodia. Because of geopolitical consideration, the Americans see Cambodia through the Chinese land. They say we finish.
Yeah.
And this is what I like all of you to consider. Thank you,
sir. Look, I might get, because Henry spoke a little bit about the benefits that he saw flowing to the region as a result of this contestation, as well as the risks. Did you want to respond to that briefly?
Yeah, when I spoke, I was giving examples from China. There are also examples that I was going to speak about what Australia is doing in the region. And my point I was trying to make was, in the Pacific, we welcome aid. Whether it's from China or from Russia or whoever, aid is important. But as Off was pointing out, it's got to be one that it really matters to us. And it's not to be one that is knee-jerk, that you're just responding because somebody is competing with you. You've got to sit down and listen to Pacific Islanders and come up with development assistance that really matters to them. That's the point that I was trying to make. I didn't, because I'm in a very difficult position to say China is doing a good job, Australia is doing a good job. I'm squashed in the middle and trying to say, okay, we have all of this coming towards us. How do we manage it so that it benefits our people? That's the challenge that I face as a Pacific Islander, because we're really squished in the middle between trying to choose which side, east or west, north or south. We've got to make those calls. But those calls, it's like Ofo was saying, doesn't have to be bad for us. It's choices that we make with partners that we deal with that brings benefit to our people.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, I think I see one up the back, ma'am. Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. The lady in the blue. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it on? Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm from Kiribati. Yeah, I'm from Kiribati, which is another small Pacific Island country that just switched from Taiwan to China a few weeks after the Solomons. On the ground level, what we are experiencing now is everyone is interested. Yeah? The Americans are coming. They want to build an embassy there. They want a large portion of land that we cannot afford. The Japanese are opening their embassy in early next year. Who else is coming? There's a lot of people coming, and the development partners are coming. We want to help you in this and that, blah, which is all very good. But the question that and the response that was given by our distinguished colleague from Papua New Guinea is, how can the government and its people manage all these different interests? Because we are failing. We lack the capacity and the observative knowledge to be able to deal with all these interests. And so part of the debate I would have loved to see, geopolitical competition is good for who? Yeah? And how do the people who are being the focus, who are being subjected to the competition and all these offers, how do they manage, how do they wisely consider all these offers, and how do they manage for their political, for their future development? Because at the end of the day, we know that we're going to be left in the lurch again, maybe, I don't know, 5-10 years down the line when all this competition is, it loses the donors lose interest. So how do we cope so that at the end of the interest, we gain something useful and not go back even further? So that's my question, which hopefully, maybe would like to consider. Thank you.
Thanks, Terrace. I might throw to you on that one. You painted a pretty grim picture there about the way that various states are able to navigate some of the things that our questioner just raised. Is there a way that they can thread this needle effectively, or do you think that the drivers are all just bad and therefore the results are likely to be poor?
Well, I think the questioner made a really good point, which was to do with the sort of time frame. If donors are engaging in a really short-term manner, a transactional kind of manner, to use the term that the Australian Minister for Development used yesterday, it's almost certain that the aid won't do much good over any sort of meaningful time period, over a time period that will matter for the people of a country. So what you really need is sustained, long-run donor commitment. And me personally, I don't think that's the sort of commitment that emerges from geopolitical competition. I think in Papua New Guinea or Solomon Islands or Tonga or Kiribati, you'll find right now this great rush. But a lot of the interest, as you said, will be short-term. The donors will turn up while it's important to them and to their geopolitical needs, and then they'll walk away.
So will it necessarily be short-term though? Because, for example, geopolitics isn't going anywhere in the Pacific anytime soon. Yes, these fashions wax and wane, but China's interest seems pretty sustained. Couldn't it drive outcomes for a fair period of time?
The other thing is the thinking. China's aid to the Pacific is falling pretty rapidly right now.
Yeah, but its interest isn't, right? You see other forms of that interest and how it manifests.
Yeah, but the thinking also needs to be long-term too. So it's not just the fact that donors might be wrestling around the Pacific for the next 2 decades, is that donors need to be thinking very carefully about the long-term benefits from whatever it is they're promising. And that's one issue I have with Chinese aid, but also you can see some problems with Australian and American and New Zealand aid to Papua New Guinea at present. They're thinking about grand infrastructure projects without thinking about how those projects are going to be successfully sustained. And donors have done that before in the past, and you end up with sort of 15 years down the track, sort of concrete ruins. So if donors are willing to go in, and I take the point from Bridie, and really engage constructively, perhaps propelled by geopolitics, then sure, we might end up giving reasonable aid as a result. But if we go in that kind of short-term manner, which seems to be a real issue at present, then it's much less likely that the aid that we give will help, I think.
I think there was one more question at the front from this gentleman here, Ben.
Thank you. Ben Clare from Exemplar International. Just one question, as for those of us working in the development sector, should we be so focused on listening to what Pacific Island governments want as opposed to what the Pacific Islands people want and need? And I reference Solomon Islands here. I mean, we just put a whole heap of guns into the hands of police because we listened to Manasseh Sogavare, when aid really should be helping the people, shouldn't it? So with my theory is with all this geopolitics going on, are we actually forgetting the people that we're meant to be partnering with and working alongside, rather than propping up a government like Manasseh Sogavare? And it was mentioned that he does have a fraught relationship with his own people. Are we actually promoting conflict in that country by working, well, even though we're working even alongside China, really, to arm the police in that country when we've got, you know, people in the disability sector who are not getting the aid they need. A lot of other groups too are being forgotten because of this fascination with keeping governments happy. So I just thought, interested in everyone's opinion on that.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I might, just because we haven't yet, might go to Ben on that one. What do you think? I mean, the rationale, and then I might come to Alice after that for her perspective, but I mean, the rationale with Sogavare has always been we have no other choice but to keep him on side because he's at the core of a group that retains control. Whether we like it or not, we simply have to keep him on side. But what's your assessment?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult, right? So I'm not going to pretend I've got the answers. I will make the comparison with the Cold War, though. I mean, like, this is not unprecedented in the sense that states have to make difficult decisions, you know, that are geopolitically driven. And, you know, that we're talking about sort of changing of allegiances diplomatically. We know in the Cold War that this was something that happened too. So it's not totally unprecedented territory. In terms of I mean, I agree with your analysis there, Ben. But I think it gets to this question of long-termism as well. And my sense of where geopolitics can make a difference is that if we look really big picture, like I think the initiators of the Marshall Plan did, there's a sense in which you can do altruism and strategy together. And so what I would hope, I'd say, is with this geopolitical turn, that you have a long-term interest in the Pacific, not purely out of a national self-interest view, but like a genuine commitment to, you know, to making a region, not in our image, that's not what I'm talking about, but these long-term partnerships. So, I mean, this is the challenge and the trade-offs and what have you. But of course, I tend to agree in the sense that, you know, sometimes when we're talking about geopolitics, the short-termism of political cycles and what have you, you know, create these incentives to act quickly and be seen to acting quickly. But I think as a development community, there's a role to push back on that in a powerful way.
Alice, did you want to have any final reflections? I mean, Solomon Islands is an interesting example, of course, not just because it's in the headlines, because we've seen so much money flow into the security space. Did you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think your question raises a really important point, which is that we have to think about who is defining national interests, who's defining what a country needs from development. And the reality is in the Pacific, if we're just talking to governments, then we're not hearing the perspective of women. We're not hearing the perspective of people with disabilities. It came up in the panel yesterday on national interest as well, that national interest should be contested. It shouldn't. I think part of the problem when we use these concepts is everyone just has their own assumption about what national interest is and what it looks like. And if we're not discussing and contesting and debating what national interests are, then we end up with these situations where the aid sector calls for investment in a particular area because it's in Australia's national interest, and we see investment in something quite different because the government has defined national interest differently, or they're seeing a different perspective on it. And so I think that kind of contestability and the discussion, and again, bringing it back to feminist foreign policy, that's one of the really central pillars, is that we need to diversify the voices of who is defining national interests, who's defining what development should look like, what foreign policy should look like, and if we're not hearing from diverse voices, then we're getting a really incomplete picture.
Because I knew I was up against a very fearsome team, I found the worst possible example I could think of from the Pacific. Now, were we talking about giving aid to Samoa, for example? I think I'd be quite happy with, leaving things in the hand of the government and government-to-government negotiations. Were we even talking about other types of aid, the Solomon Islands, that didn't involve guns? The situation might be quite different. So sometimes, dealing with political elites is never as good as dealing with the people or with civil society organizations, but sometimes it's still a lot better than simply listening to people like me in capital cities and donor countries, of course. So throughout much of the Pacific, I would be less worried than I am by the current example of the guns in the Solomon Islands. So.
All right, I think we've got time for one or two more. Yes, sir. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Nilesh Gandar from USP in Suva. I just had a question for the affirmative team. Whether they think that geopolitical competition is good for all types of forms of aid.
Sorry, which team? I missed that.
It's for the affirmative team.
Oh, for the affirmative team, right.
So I'll repeat the question. Whether geopolitical competition is good for all types of forms of aid.
Oh, right, whether some aids, right, some forms of aid. So that's an interesting one. Bridie, do you want to take a shot at that?
You owe me, Stephen?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, so I think one of the mistakes we sometimes make when we're talking about aid is we reduce it down to either one set of beneficiaries or one modality. So for example, delivering training when we all know that there's really sophisticated programming going on, like supporting women's organisations, supporting, social protection system establishment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, not to dodge your question, but it's impossible to say, is geopolitics good for all aid or not? One thing I do think that it is good for as a development community is I would love it if a year later we're not talking about the moral case for aid, the security case for aid, or the economic case for aid, or the influence case for aid. In fact, what we're doing is getting much more articulate, like Ben's question was forcing us to do, in saying, you know what, if we think, and in this room there will be lots of different mental models, right? Some of you will be thinking, if we think that development is about supporting those most vulnerable in poverty alleviation, human freedom terms, then we will absolutely be investing in non-government apparatus. We'll be investing in disability inclusion and all the rest of it. If we're Stefan Durkin and we think that development comes from an elite bargain and local political leadership, then absolutely we will continue to engage with the elites of governments to try and unlock that development potential. If we think that development is actually about regional relationships and our place in the world, we will be investing in people-to-people linkages. And instead of all fighting each other over what is more important, is it engaging government or is it engaging the grassroots, I would hope that we're actually able to have a conversation around what is the right balance for Australia's investment, country by country, informed by the right mix of people. And I think in that sense, maybe to answer your question, geopolitics, if we allow it, will be very good for increasing the sophistication of the way we think about our development program, because it will uncover the fact that we are all right with our mental models. There is a place for development everywhere, but the priorities will differ based on the advice of the people where we see.
All right, I think we've got time for one more question. Oh, just over there. Yes, ma'am.
Hi there, my name's Ali and I work for WWF Australia. We heard last night at the dinner from Adil Najam, and he made the compelling argument that climate is development. So my question to our debaters is, would you as readily hold your positions in the affirmative or negative if the question today was, is geopolitical competition good for climate?
So that is, all right, so I'm... So we need another hour and a half, right? Off, or did you want to say something and then offer maybe after that? Yeah.
Huge fight over climate change. Because climate change and relationships weren't that great. Since the Labour government came into power, they've legislated to reduce the emissions and relationships have somewhat improved. Right? So I suspect that geopolitics plays into climate change. And you know, our Pacific leaders have really stepped up to the global level to raise issues around climate change because they consider it an existential threat. And I think geopolitics will play into the favor of Pacific Island countries' agenda on addressing, climate security. And the clear reaction from Australia responding to that is what I can attest to why geopolitics is actually great for the Pacific.
All right, Alpha, did you want to have a final comment on that just before we wrap it up?
Yeah, just quickly, there's no way out of it. I mean, look at the displaced communities and countries, Tuvalu, for example, Kiribati, who are going to have to migrate out of their island countries and, what essentially is their whole identity. So geopolitics has to get involved. But like I said, break down the power hierarchy and let's start talking as equals and really taking genuine care to listen to those who are in the most affected areas because of climate. Thank you.
Hello. And I would just a very final observation, just watching the Morrison government up close. I mean, I know there's widespread, a widespread feeling that the Morrison government's targets were totally inadequate, but even getting them to net zero, it's really, I think, hard to overstate how important the Pacific was in that, because Morrison actually did feel the squeeze. Right? You could see it. You could see it when you went in and actually talked to the government about it. That was the one pressure point that actually told. Geopolitics again. Anyway, I digress. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers for a really great debate? And I hope you have a great conference.
Thank you. I just also, could you put your hands together for Stephen Dziedzic as well? Great job, Stephen. And I think we'll do this next year. Thanks.